The Road Murder, 1860, Part 2. The search for the murderer begins. As we've seen, William Nutt and Thomas Benger moved near the house. They'd been directed by Samuel Kent to go and search for my lost child. Nutt said to Benger, "We might as well search for a dead child as for one alive." So the family servants, Nutt, Benger, P.C. Urch, Parish Constable Morgan, began their search for the missing boy. It was long before Nutt and Benger walked towards the disused servants' privy, a few yards from the house. Here they found a blood-stained newspaper. William ran to the house for a candle. It was at this privy some years earlier that Constance and her brother William had once run away. Constance, dressed as a boy, had cut her hair and left her locks in the old privy in the shrubbery. By 1860, it was hardly ever used. As Thomas's eyes got used to the dark, he saw something light in colour, which he retrieved, and found it was a blanket, heavily blood-stained. Nutt and Mary Holcombe arrived with a candle, and in its light revealed a boy lying on the splashboard. The blanket was lying on top of the child. Further searching revealed a blood-stained piece of flannel. They lifted up the body from the privy, and as they did so, the head fell back, showing a wound to the neck which had almost decapitated the child. Let's consider the movements and behaviour of Samuel Kent that morning. As we've seen, he remained in bed while the whole household was becoming frantic searching for the child. When he does get up, he immediately leaves the scene. Would not his place have been to remain at home, to comfort his heavily pregnant wife and organise a search? There were plenty of others who could have gone to Trowbridge to fetch the police. And as he'd been told, he only needed to go to the next village to Southwick to contact them. Look at his journey to Trowbridge. He had to go himself. There's been much debate as to when on his journey he was met and informed of the discovery of Savile's body. The local vicar, the Reverend Peacock, a friend of Kent, as soon as he's heard the news via Constant, was sent to fetch him back. And he left on horseback to chase after Samuel Kent. Kent had reached the toll gate at Southwick and reported to Mrs. Hall, the gatekeeper. His child had been stolen, carried away in a blanket. Where was the nearest policeman? Carried away in a blanket. Nobody at that stage knew a blanket was missing. Mrs. Kent later was asked concerning this a few months later, and she said, "Before my husband left, I was aware the blanket had been taken with the child. I knew it was so because the nurse had told me so." Yet the nurse's evidence, Elizabeth Goff, frequently repeated the first time she missed the blanket was when she saw it brought in around the dead child. Yet Kent acknowledged the child had been carried away in a blanket. No one knew the blanket was missing until the child was found. The consensus is that Kent did not reach Trowbridge before the Reverend Peacocks reached him. In fact, Reverend Peacock, travelling on horseback and Kent in his carriage, would suggest that the horse had travelled a lot faster. Kent said later he'd reached Trowbridge before Peacock met him. Was there another motive for Kent's sudden journey from Roadhill House? All was confusion there at Roadhill House, and by all accounts there were all these villagers, families, servants, police over the crime scene. P.C. Urch had now been sent to Frome to get members of the Somerset Constabulary. Dr. Joshua Parsons, whom William had been sent to get from Beckington, examined the corpse and showed that the throat had been slashed. It seemed Saville had died instantly. There was also a wider, blunter, deeper chest wound. In his evidence, Dr. Parsons said the stab had penetrated the nightgown and the shirt. It severed the 6th and 7th cartilage of the 2 ribs and penetrated more than half through the chest. There were 2 smaller wounds on the left hand, one which had not bled. The body had been face down, and the blood had settled in darkened areas around the mouth. Dr. Parsons believed the boy had been dead for at least 5 hours. The time of the examination must have been about 9 a.m. Superintendent Foley now arrived with PC Heritage Southwick and PC Dallimore of Trowbridge. The police first viewed the body in the laundry, and then they saw the opened drawing room window, the nursery, and the cot. The nurse was questioned concerning the missing blanket, replying the first time she knew the blanket was missing was when she saw it with the body. When Urchin Morgan had earlier asked her before the body was found, she had told her a blanket was missing. In the meanwhile, the privy vault was emptied, and nothing further was found. Others arrived on the scene, including Kent's legal advisor, Roland Rodway, and Joseph Stapleton, a local surgeon, who had been their doctor when they were at Colston. Samuel Kent was telling people he was certain the crime was committed by someone outside the house. He restricted police access to the kitchen area and the nursery, the drawing room, and the grounds. By this time, any evidence anywhere in the house could easily have been destroyed. Later, the police were given access to the whole house, but Samuel Kent was still insisting they were wasting their time. Stapleton says he was sure that Samuel Kent was shielding a member of the household. The police then turned their search to the nightclothes of the household. But that seemed very vague. Dr. Parsons was later to say that Foley examined some, he others, but did they look at Constance's nightdress? She normally wore a clean one Sunday night, and that dress was examined by Dr. Parsons, and he thought it was so clean, had it even been worn. Mary Ann's nightdress only showed any signs of blood, and these were accepted to be from natural causes. Mary Ann's nightdress, however, was taken away by Mrs. Dallimore. There was, however, that day to be a further discovery that's often been confused with the missing nightdresses. Later that afternoon in the scullery, the police found in the flue of the boiler, which had been lit that morning, despite some authors claiming it hadn't, a blood-stained garment wrapped in brown paper. The police took it out and found a very dirty blood-stained chemise or shift or undergarment. The news of the discovery was soon made known, and Kent found out, and Stapleton examined it. He believed this filthy blood-stained garment was Mary Ann's nightdress, which was not, either by its condition or the fact that her nightdress was now with Mrs. Dallimore. The details given of the chemise of short length, made of coarse material, with holes under the arms and well worn around the knees. There was blood on the back 16 inches of it. This is how it was described at the time. It was a chemise, an undergarment in common use, standard accepted pattern of the mid-19th century. Its shape remained unaltered for many years. It had a very severe plainness, characterized in the articles meant to be concealed from view, totally distinguishing it from a nightdress, which invariably was full length and long sleeved. Constance's was a plain nightdress without frills, but her sister's had frills on them. Sergeant Watts said, "The garment was nearly worn out. There were holes under the arms. It was in a very dirty state. The blood extended about 16 inches from the bottom. There were no marks of blood above the waist. The marks of blood and smears nearly covered the tail part. I should think from the appearance the blood had been caused from the inside. The strain was greater behind than before. There was no blood on the paper that it was wrapped in. I should not think the marks had been there very long, but should not think they had been made that day. Mrs. Dallimore also saw it, said it was of coarse material, it was dirty, it was ragged, it was mended, and it appears to have been worn out of the bottom by kneeling on it, and appears to have been dirty long before the stains were on it, and been worn as long as possible afterwards. I believe the stains were from natural causes. P.C. Dallimore, it was very dirty, it was well worn, it had been repaired near the arm, it appeared to have been worn for a week or two, longer possibly. The stain in the front was small in comparison to the stain behind. And yet that garment's description, there were those who considered it to have been one of the family's nightdresses. Jesuit Bridges, in her book Saint with Red Hands, suggests it was the nightdress of the nurse. Early that Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Dallimore had come to search the clothing of the female servants. She later gave evidence it was not Cox or Kerslake, and it did not belong to Mrs. Holcombe. This left the 14-year-old Emily Doole. Emily was not searched, as she was not a resident servant. So it was decided that the blood-stained garment had nothing to do with the crime, and it should be returned to the place where it was found. And this was done on the Monday morning. The fact of the missing nightdress was to reappear a few days later. Permission was given for a post-mortem from the coroner, Dr. Sylvester, and this was conducted by Drs. Stapleton and Parsons. They removed the clothing, and a wound was discovered to the chest, a stab wound made by a pointed knife the surgeons were certain of. And due to the lack of blood, this had been done after death. It was felt that the cause of death was the wound to the throat, but Dr. Parsons also noticed some small trickles of blood on the face and blackening around the mouth. These wounds would indicate death may not have been due to the throat injury. One final event happened on that Saturday. It was agreed by Foley and Samuel Kent that two policemen, Urch and Heritage, should be allowed in the house that night to see if the murderer should seek to destroy any evidence. It was Samuel Kent who suggested the kitchen range would be a good place to do so, while the rest of the household slept. Of the rest of the household, only Mrs. Kent knew of their presence, although sleeping arrangements for most of the family had changed. The policemen arrived and were let into the kitchen, where they were given cheese, bread, and beer. 2 a.m. Heritage felt it was time to go, but they found themselves locked in and locked out of the rest of the house. The part of the house they had access to was the adjoining scullery and the back door to the yard where the dog was roaming. In the passageway was the locked laundry containing Savile's body. After Heritage had been knocking on the door for 20 minutes, Samuel Kent appeared and asked why they'd been locked in. Kent replied, "Oh, I've been walking about." Heritage left. Urch was again locked in till 5:30, which time he too was let out. Superintendent Foley was angry and embarrassed when he found of Samuel Kent's actions, for rather than being locked in the house, they had in fact been locked out of most of it. A fact he told Heritage and Urch that must be kept quiet. Monday the 2nd of July. The inquest opened at 10 o'clock at the Red Lion Hotel. A jury with Reverend Peacock as foreman was sworn in. The jury were allowed to view the house. The room at the Red Lion proved far too small, and the Chief Constable Meredith suggested adjourning to the larger Temperance Hall. Sarah Cox was called and gave evidence concerning the drawing room window, which Sarah Cox said, "It was my duty as housemaid to fasten the doors and windows at night. The first part, including the drawing room. The drawing room door has a bolt at the top. I locked the door and fastened the bolt at the top on 29th of June. Went to bed about 11:15. On coming down in the morning, I observed the door was unfastened. The drawing room shutters, the upper ones were fastened, the lower ones put together. The window was a little way open. It was about a foot up. No force had been used in trying to open it. On going into the room, I observed no marks or disarrangement of any kind or any marks on the carpet. So the door, which had been locked from the inside, was now open. So therefore it had been opened by an inhabitant of the house. It had been made to look as if somebody had come in through the drawing room window. Next, Elizabeth Goff was called, and then Thomas Benger and William Nutt described finding the body. The evidence was now next given by a local butcher, Stephen Millett, who said that the blood spilled was not more than a pint and a half, and he would have expected more from such a wound, somewhere about 3 pints. How this evidence is produced is unclear, as some blood must have gone into the privy vault. Dr. Parsons next spoke at the post-mortem, and he said he felt the blackening around the mouth resulted from a blanket or hand being forced over the child's mouth. Parsons was not asked to consider what was the cause of death, but before taking his seat, he said, "It is my opinion that the child had been smothered by the pressure of a soft substance over the mouth." Foley said he was certain the child had been killed in the privy. The coroner then sought to close the inquest. No further witnesses were to be called, and he began to sum up. The jury were not happy, and the foreman stood up and indicated that some of the jury wanted other members of the household to be called. The jury wanted to question members of the household, especially Constance and William, but the feeling against the children was such that the inquest had to be adjourned to the kitchen of Road Hill House, much to the disquiet of the public who had crowded into the Temperance Hall. And here at Road Hill House, Constance said she'd retired to bed about 10:30 on Friday, knowing nothing about the disappearance of her brother. She had not left the bed, nor did she hear anything odd. She knew of no resentment against the boy or stresses within the house, and that the nurse had always been kind and attentive. William gave the same sort of evidence, adding that the child was a great favourite of everyone. The coroner reminded the jury of the evidence, that no one had entered the house. Gentlemen of the jury, this is the most mysterious and atrocious murder committed by person or persons unknown. I fear it will not fall to your lot under the present aspect of the case to incriminate any person connected with this. The cause of death is apparent to you, but the mystery lies in this. What cause or motive could have induced the perpetrator of the deed to have murdered a child 3 years and 10 months old in this way? The jury very reluctantly signed the forms returning the verdict. The verdict was willful murder by persons unknown. The inquest had lasted 5 hours. The coroner had failed in his duty. 3 tasks should have been ascertained. First, the cause of death. Secondly, the nature of death. Was it murder, manslaughter? And the inquest should have sought to ascertain who was responsible. Cause of death had been mentioned by Dr. Parsons. The coroner, however, believed that the cause was due to the neck wound. Condemnation of the coroner was soon to follow in the press and in the locality. It's evident that Kent had put pressure on the coroner to keep the inquest details to a minimum and take spotlight away from the family. The inquest was later to be reviewed, when it was to be stated that never before had George Sylvester's work been questioned. Were there other links between Kent and Sylvester? We will never know. In the meanwhile, the fact of the missing nightdress was again raised. The Kent's washerwoman, Mrs. Holly, had taken the washing from the house on that Monday morning. There'd been gossip in the area about a missing nightdress. Esther Holly was in a hurry to confirm this. So as soon as she collected the 2 baskets of clothing, she set about checking it. Yes, there were normally 4 nightdresses belonging to the family. Today there were indeed only 3. Esther Holly knew it was Constance's nightdress that was missing. The following day, Esther Holly went again to Roadhill House to collect the money and also the laundry book that had not been placed with the washing. On arriving home, her daughter checked the book. There were 4 nightdresses entered in the book. Soon the police arrived at Holly's cottage, and they brought a flannel that had been found in the vault, later identified as a breast flannel, for Esther Holly to identify. Before being asked anything, she told the police the clothes were right with the book. Esther Holly was digging herself into a hole. She had now lied to the police. Her daughter Martha was sent over to the house to sort things out. Sarah Cox was certain that there were 4 nightdresses in the washing. She had packed the washing baskets. Mrs. Kent and Mary Ann had written the list in the laundry book, and they soon appeared, confirming the number of nightdresses in the washing and in the book as 4. Mrs. Holly now comes to the house, and the result of that was Samuel Kent accusing her of stealing the nightdress. The police arrived again to search the Holly's house and those of her relatives in the village. Nothing was found. Again, Samuel Kent is seeking to place blame on those outside of his own household. Foley questioned those involved, and it was certain that there were 4 nightdresses packed. But by the time the washing had left the house to go to Mrs. Holly's house, there were only 3 in the washing basket. Captain Meredith, Chief Constable of Wiltshire, stated he was the opinion that 2 people at least were involved in the crime. Roland Rodway indicated the fact to Samuel Kent that he was certain that the murder was committed by someone from within the household. Kent would not have it, and Roland Rodway resigned as Kent's legal advisor. Saville's funeral took place on Friday the 6th of July at East Colston, where Saville was buried with Samuel's first wife. The efforts of the police seemed to be getting nowhere. Trowbridge magistrates were becoming increasingly worried by the events, and the magistrates wrote to the Home Secretary asking for help from Scotland Yard. To begin with, the Home Office and Scotland Yard did not feel this necessary. Trowbridge magistrates themselves decided they needed to investigate happenings. And on Monday, the 9th of July, that body of men arrived at the Temperance Hall in Road to hold a private inquiry. It was to Nurse Elizabeth Gough they first turned their attention, and the breast flannel found in the privy. Mrs. Dallimore had washed it and brought it to Roadhill House, and she'd asked the servants to try it on. The only person it fitted was Elizabeth Gough. Elizabeth Gough was questioned at the magistrate's inquiry. The 2 Sarahs, Holcomb, Alloway, Dr. Parsons, and Esther Holly and her daughter were also interviewed. The next day, Elizabeth Gough was called again, and as a result, she was kept in custody of Mrs. Dallimore in Trowbridge. On 12th of July, Trowbridge magistrates again sought help from Scotland Yard, and this time, Scotland Yard sent Inspector Jonathan Whitcher of the Yard to Wiltshire. Jonathan Whitcher surveyed the evidence and quickly concluded that Constance was the chief suspect. He confronted her with the fact of the missing nightdress. But Constance said it's gone missing in the laundry the day after the murder. Nevertheless, Witcher had Constance charged with the murder of her baby brother. The girl burst into tears, pleading her innocence. At the committal hearing at Devizes on the 27th of July, the nurse swore she had never known Constance behave any other than well towards the child, and that the walls of the girl's bedroom were so thin she could not have sneaked out without being heard. Constance said on that Friday before the discovery she brought the child a present. So with the failure of Witcher to solve the crime, Foley again takes charge, as Constance was released, and Witcher moved back to London. And Foley now started to make further inquiries. He felt the murder weapon would not be found, but the missing nightdress, maybe. And if he could find that, then that would be one in the eye for Witcher, one up for the Wiltshire men. So working firstly on the idea that the nightdress for some reason may have been in the coffin of the dead child, he had permission to exhume the coffin and open the coffin. This was done at the beginning of August. The only effect was that the man who opened the coffin was sick for days afterwards, but no nightdress was found. Next, an investigation was carried out as to if Elizabeth Goff's statement that she could see from her bed that Saville was in his cot or not. Captain Meredith put a dark blanket in the cot and knelt on the nurse's bed, showing that the nurse was not telling the truth, as he could not see the blanket. Further inquiries were conducted by a Bath solicitor, Mr. Slack, during which first time all the members of the household were questioned. The next major event was the arrest of Elizabeth Goff, charged with the wilful murder of Saville Kent, although the police were certain that she was not alone responsible for the murder. Her arrest, it was felt, may reveal others who had been involved in the crime. So at the beginning of October, at Trowbridge Police Court, Elizabeth Goff was tried and the previous evidence presented. Samuel Kent was questioned. During this questioning, the fact of the policeman locked in the kitchen was revealed. Something that Foley had sought to keep quiet was now out in the open. Kent was also questioned regarding the missing blanket, and now he changed his story. Earlier, he told Foley that he had not known about it. Mrs. Kent also said that she had been told by the nurse the blanket had been taken. The result of the trial was Elizabeth Goff was released to her uncle, who provided £100 bail. Further inquiries followed. Another meeting of the magistrates. Thomas Sanders, a retired barrister from Bradford-on-Avon, began an investigation in November. At the beginning, the police were represented by Captain Meredith, Superintendents Foley and Wolfe, and other police officers. The inquiry soon developed into no more than a farce. To many, it was a day's entertainment. Some of the witnesses at this inquiry included Fricker, the man who had repaired the missing lantern. He was asked as to when Samuel Kent was at home, and if he was at home at the time of the repair. And there were questions asked as to when Samuel Kent was around that previous week. The relevance of the questioning is unclear. Questioning further, Saunders asked, "Who fed the dog?" No reply was given. It's thought by some the dog may have been drugged, but he was heard to be clearly barking. Saunders went on further with this line of questioning as to ascertain if Kent was at home. He next moved on to find out if Kent was at church the previous Sunday to the murder. James Holcombe was next called and asked as to Kent's whereabouts that week. Again, no clear answer was given. Members of the original jury then spoke concerning the conduct of the inquest. The warning off of some local men from the jury's selection and the seeming hushing up of the whole matter by the coroner. Mr. Arthur Langley appeared and stated he had seen Samuel Kent the night before the murder standing in a field. There were, at this inquiry, however, other items that came to light. The witness of a local man who had testified seeing Mr. Kent in his shirt sleeves in a nearby field at 5 o'clock on that Saturday morning. Later, however, the witness said he could not be certain it was Samuel Kent. And Mrs. Conse stated that Mr. Saunders had said to her husband had seen Samuel Kent in the grounds of Roedale House on the morning of the 30th of June. She said it was a falsehood. Her husband could not have done so from the windows of their cottage as they could attend the inquiry. Her mind was soon on other matters, and she became agitated. She hurried from her seat and said, "My boilers are going," and left the room. Day 2, 5th of November. The question as to whether if Samuel and Samuel Kent were in church on the 24th of June was cleared up. A Judith Webley had sat near him. During further questioning by Saunders, a child started squabbling. Saunders said, "That child must be moved. Take that child out," Foley said. Saunders, "Not if it will be quiet." Soon another child cried. This time he was ejected. On the 8th of November, the other thing that Foley had sought to keep quiet for so long, the chemise in the flue, was at last brought into the open. P.C. Urch was asked, "Were you present when Sergeant Watts in Roedale House found a certain thing?" "What was it?" "Some woman's night shift." Saunders, "I don't wish to mislead you. Was it a night shift or a day shift?" "It was a shift." On 9th of November, it was reported the smallest audience assembled so far was present. The Bradford and Avon magistrates met. The Trowbridge magistrates began to ask questions. Was the missing night dress belonging to Constance? They met on 30th of November, but evidence was heard of the discovery of the shift, and it was made clear that the garment found in the flue was not Constance's missing night dress, although Witcher, who had never seen it, believed it was. Questions were also asked concerning the inquest. The onus was put on the coroner as to why the original inquest should not be quashed. The following year, at Westminster, the Queen versus Sylvester decided there had been misconduct on part of the coroner. The Kent family moved from Rome in 1861. The contents of the house were put on sale. And so the village of Rode resumed its normal, quiet life. Constance, following her release, was sent away by her father to a finishing school in Brittany, France. Though here rumours followed her, and it was clear she could not stay here long either. Constance was soon admitted to a convent school in Dinan. In France, she was very quiet and unremarkable except for her kindness to children. She stayed there for 2 years until the 10th of August 1863, when she returned to England, this time to Brighton. And here was a religious order that was very much in the High Church order, following the ideas of Pusey. It was run by a Reverend Arthur Douglas Wagner and a superior, Catherine Green. It seems that under these Catholic and High Church influences, Constance became deeply religious. The case was unsolved, and it seemed it would remain so forever. Then suddenly, 5 years later, in 1865, it once again burst onto the public scene. Constance confessed to the murder. Firstly, in the secret of the confessional, details of which, although under pressure, Wagner would never disclose. Later, he was to speak of a private confession, which appears to be at variance to the public confession. Constance's confession read, I, Constance Emily Kent, alone and unaided on the night of the 29th of June 1860, murdered at Roadhill House, Wiltshire, one Francis Saville Kent. Before the deed, no one knew of my intention, nor after my guilt. No one assisted me in the crime, nor in the evasion of discovery. At Easter 1865, Constance asked that her confession be made public. And on the 25th of April, accompanied by Reverend Wagner and Miss Green, Constance appeared before Bow Street magistrates, confessing publicly and in writing to the murder of her stepbrother. When the confession was read out in court, she fell down in tears. Constance always sought to deny any cruelty by her brother and stepmother, as letters written from the jail showed. Her father read about the confession in his home now in Llangollen in Wales. As the murder was committed in Wiltshire, the trial must also be in Wiltshire, so on the 26th of April 1865, Trowbridge awoke to a trial, as Constance was placed before Trowbridge magistrates. Constance was remanded to appear in court on the 5th of May. On the 1st of May, Samuel Kent arrived to visit his daughter, who was in Devizes jail. At Trowbridge Police Court on the 5th, Constance appeared once again, and the witnesses once again gave their evidence. Sarah Cox was now Sarah Rogers, having married George Rogers of Steeple Ashton. Witcher had said in 1816, nothing will be known about the murder until Miss Constance Kent confesses. Superintendent Foley had died in 1865. Soon another witness was to die. Mary Drew Kent died suddenly on the 17th of August 1865. Cause of death, congestion of the lungs. The age of 44, the same age as the first Mrs. Kent had died at. Constance was sent for trial at Salisbury on the 21st of July 1865. Witnesses were called ready to testify. Constance, when she appeared, was in black and pleaded guilty. This prevented the admission of any fresh evidence. It was one of the shortest murder trials on record. Summing up, the judge stated she admitted feelings of anger and jealousy in her heart, to which Constance clearly said, not jealousy. Judge Wiles, with the black cap on his head, sentenced her to death. According to her detailed confession, she said she had obtained a razor from her father's wardrobe a few days before the crime, although he never noticed it was missing, and how would Constance know which razor he used? She'd placed candles in the privy, and the night of the crime went to bed and waited until about midnight, when all the family were asleep, before she rose, went downstairs, opened the shutters on the drawing room window, went upstairs to the nursery, lifted the child from the cot, putting the blanket to one side, replaced the covers, and then wrapped the boy in the blanket. Taking the child downstairs, carrying the boy, who was no lightweight, put on her galoshes, and with the boy still asleep in the blanket in one arm, she opened the window, climbed out, and walked around the house to the shrubbery, where she cut Saville's throat with the hidden razor. She says she thought the blood would never come. She thought it would have gushed instantly and in profusion. She panicked. Was he dead? So she thrust the razor-like knife into the child's chest. The post-mortem indicated that the body wound could not have been inflicted by a razor. She put the baby's corpse with the blanket still wrapped around it in the toilet. Another inconsistency. The men who found the body were certain the blanket was not wrapped around the body because it was retrieved first from the top of the body. Back in her bedroom, she found 2 spots of blood on her nightdress. An almost incredible claim when she supposedly just cut the boy's throat, holding him in her arms. She washed out the 2 spots, disposing of the water in the foot basin she had used earlier, and put on a dry nightdress. The next day, she washed her nightdress. It was dry, which seems unlikely. She folded it and put it away. Her nightdress was seen by 2 people, neither of whom saw any marks, though she said a few days later she had to destroy the nightdress because there were 2 very slight marks in it that had not been thoroughly washed out. She then had to claim that the nightdress had been sent to the laundry and lost in the washing, when in fact she had distracted the maid's attention while she was putting the washing together and retrieved it for destroying it later. The next morning after the murder, she had time to clean the razor and replace it where it had been originally. Mrs. Kent was in the room most of that day. Her motive, she confessed, was revenge against her stepmother, by whom she felt slighted. The children of the original Mrs. Kent, and she harboured these slights in a resentful way. The blooded garment in the boiler of the kitchen was never explained, neither lack of blood at the scene of the crime. Description as to how she lifted the child from the cot and put the blanket to one side is taken almost verbatim from the book Great Crime, written in 1861 by Joshua Stapleton. It seems incredible she was able to do these things. Open the window, put on her galoshes, all in effective silence. The time of the murder. This has never finally been established, but I would suggest at 1 a.m. At that time, Stapleton put the death due to the state of the corpse. It was also at 1 a.m. that P.C. Urch heard Kent's dog barking. At the same time, a local man called Moon was poaching trout in the river, and he also heard the dog barking. However, Mrs. Kent was sure she heard the window open at first light soon after 4 a.m. Constance spent 20 years in Portland and Millbank Prison. At Millbank, she became a nurse and was described as being of high intellect. 1885, she was released at the age of 41. Petitions were sent to the Home Secretary earlier, but were to no avail. She was described as a small mouse-like creature, with much of the promptitude of a mouse or lizard, surprisingly disappearing when alarmed by the approach of any stranger or an unknown face who she feared might come to spy her out. This caused Constance much alarm. What then of Constance after 1885? Rumours circulated in Wiltshire. Had she become insane like her mother? Did a mad woman commit suicide in London in 1889? Was that Constance? In Road, rumours of an old lady in black who many years later in 1930 sat in the Red Lion asking questions about the murder. Many locals said, "'Tis Constance." John Road ends his book. The truth is probably she died within a year or so of her release. The fact was she journeyed to Australia with her brother William in 1886. Then in 1890 she began training as a nurse in Melbourne. She ran a nursing home until the age of 88. She marked her 100th birthday and died on Easter Monday, 10th of April 1944. What then happened that summer's night in 1860? This is my view of the facts. Today, her so-called confession would not have stood up to scrutiny and would have been totally disregarded as before getting to court. This is the way I consider the murder as jealous of the relationship of that second Mrs. Kent. And it was clear that the two families separated in the household. That night she went to bed as usual, put out her candle and seemed to be asleep when her sisters checked on her. She was waiting for the rest of the household to sleep. Downstairs, Samuel had finished his tour of the house, but had not gone to his room, but to the nursery. There Elizabeth Gough was waiting for him. Earlier we considered his sexual advances, 200 servants who came and went, and the relationship with Mary Pratt when she was a nurse. It was now time for Elizabeth Gough to be the object of his sexual desires. Together they crept into the next door spare room. Upstairs, Constance was certain all was quiet and crept down to the nursery, where she was concerned to see the nurse's bed empty, so she must act very quickly. She picks up Saville. He begins to stir and murmur. She takes the blanket with him out of the room, down the front stairs, leaving the house, intending to leave him in the disused privy. Constance takes him there, leaving him with a stab wound done by the kitchen knife, collected from outside the door. This was the cause of the dog barking. With the knife, she tried to push the body into the vault of the privy. Saville was already dead. While carrying him downstairs, the child had suffocated. Whether intentionally or not is uncertain, but 2 drops of blood had run from his nose onto Constance's nightdress. Constance returned, but this time by the back stairs. She noticed the 2 spots of blood. Later on the Monday, she distracted the servants by claiming to seek for her lost purse and asking for a drink of water. While this was being fetched, she removed the missing nightdress from the items listed in the basket. On that night, however, on the first floor, Samuel was now leaving Elizabeth Gough. First she returns to the nursery, then he will go to bed. They cannot be seen together. Before he has time to leave the spare room, the nurse returns to tell him Saville is missing. There can be no doubt in Samuel's mind as to who is responsible. It must be Constance. Now Samuel seeks to cover up for her. He remembers the incident years before when William and Constance ran away to Bath dressed as 2 boys, leaving their clothes and hair in the privy. That must be the first place to look for him. Leaving the nurse to remake the cot. Remember the words of Elizabeth Gough regarding the cot. It was as if his mother or I did it. Samuel takes his dark lantern to the privy, avoiding the dog by going out the front door. Yes, sure enough, in the privy is Saville. He's cold, he's dead. To Samuel's mind comes the fact some years ago there were some cutthroat murders in the area that were never solved. He must cover up for his family and make it look as if the murder was committed by an outsider. Samuel takes a knife from the kitchen knife box. The dog, knowing its master, does not bark. He cuts the throat of his son. His hands are now covered in blood. He must find a way of destroying the evidence, the dark lantern, which is never found. His shirt. No record of Samuel's clothes was ever listed or checked. He either concealed them in the carriage or elsewhere. He washes himself, sits in the study, pondering what he has done. He realizes he must show that the murder had got into the house. Samuel could not risk any noise, breaking down a door or window. The window in the drawing room. Yes, it would have to be that way. It's nearly light. The servants will soon be up. Samuel opens the window 6 inches, as far as it will go. Even then, Mrs. Kent, who was 8 months pregnant, who had not been sleeping well, heard this. It was just light, about 4 a.m. Samuel goes to bed to await the events of the morning. He cannot be there when the body is discovered. He would show too much emotion, so he plans to go to Trowbridge to keep himself out of their way. It's also possible for him to bury the lantern and his blood-stained garments, or he had the opportunity to burn these while the police were locked in the kitchen. It's evident that both Samuel and Constance knew each other were involved in the crime. That blood-stained garment in the boiler flue had nothing to do with it. The idea of Constance being able to almost decapitate her brother at the age of 16 seems so unlikely. The rest, they say, is history.